Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. I hope you're having a fantastic day. I'm doing really well, just doing my usual thing, just about to share with you some ideas on a great book that I have reread. So I first heard the name of Nadine Gordimer when I was a kid because my mother was reading this exact book right here, La Historia de mi hijo, or My Son's Story, during one of the many trips that we went on when I was a kid. It was not as a kid that I read her, though. I read her many years after that when I was in college, not because she was assigned reading for any of my classes or anything like that, but just because I was doing my own Nobel Prize reading project. And the novel that I read at that time was one that I found at Half Price Books, which was July's People. I did not know that this was one of her most famous novels. I just picked it up and I read it. And right after this one, I read My Son's Story in English, of course. This is the one that I enjoyed the most, but for my video on Nadine Gordimer, I decided to focus on the novel that is her most popular, at least here in the US. That is, of course, July's People. It turns out that I enjoyed this a lot more upon rereading it than on my first experience of encountering this text, so that's what I want to share with you right now. So let's explore July's People. Now, if you want to know Nadine Gordimer as an author and as a person, I would recommend that you read this book, Conversations with Nadine Gordimer. To me, there's nothing like reading conversations with authors, or hearing them, if that is a possibility also. Now, most readers associate Nadine Gordimer, and quite rightly I would say, with apartheid. As you know, it was a system of institutionalized racial segregation that was in effect in South Africa from 1948 actually up to the early 1990s. In an interview, however, this is something that I wanted to share with you, Nadine Gordimer said that she did not write about apartheid, but she wrote about people. She did not consider herself to be a feminist. She was Jewish, but that is not really an aspect of her life and her experience that she explores in her works. At one point, she also identified as an atheist. So what is the key thing? What is the formative experience or reality for her? That is being a white African. And in the interview, in one of the interviews that I watched, one of the questions that she was asked was, who are your influences? The typical question that you would ask a writer. And she mentioned two primarily. She said Chekhov and Proust. Okay, so I thought that was very interesting. And then in interviews that I read in the book of Conversations with her, she also mentioned, for example, Maupassant, Welty, and Hemingway. I think in those she is primarily thinking as a short story writer, because she is famous for her short stories, not only for her novels. It was in 1991 that she received the Nobel Prize in Literature, and I want to read you the citation so that we can keep that in and consider it as we explore her work. To Nadine Gordimer, quote, who through her magnificent epic writing has, in the words of Alfred Nobel, been of great benefit to humanity. So that is the citation for her Nobel Prize, and that is a little bit, just a little bit about Nadine Gordimer. Let's explore July's People then, okay? So what we have here is a very brief novel that was published in 1981. This is her 8th novel. It's only 160 pages, but it is incredibly powerful and incredibly insightful. It is the premise really that to me makes it stand out from the other novels by Nadine Gordimer. Basically what we have here is a novel that explores South Africa at a time of civil war after apartheid has come to an end because of an uprising. So for that reason, it has been associated with the genre or the subgenre of alternate history. Basically, in a nutshell, July's People is the story of the Smales family, Maureen, her husband Bam for Bamford, and their 3 children, Victor, Gina, and Royce. And what they do is they escape the violence in Johannesburg because of this civil war and this uprising that is going on, and they hide in their former servant July's village. So looking at the characters, I would like to start with July because the novel bears his name in the title. July has been working for the Smales family for 15 years, okay? And by helping them, basically, he's putting himself and his family and the entire village at risk, as you can imagine. His wife, for example, at the beginning of the novel, when she sees that he has brought the Smales family with him, she asks him, why can't they just help themselves? Why cannot they take care of themselves, right? It's something that white people in South Africa have always done. She cannot understand how this white family can be all of a sudden helpless, because she is not aware of what is happening in the cities, this uprising and this civil war that is going on. Maureen and Bam, the Smaleses, for their part, they are liberals, okay? They have treated July well throughout their lives, and they had good intentions, really, as we can see from the events that are narrated in the novel. But as tends to be the case in situations like this one, they ultimately never really understood July and the situation that he was in as a black man in South Africa. Now the kids, okay, the children, they're not tremendously important, I would say, to the plot of the novel, but there's at least one very important point that is made through the characters of the children. So I'm going to mention that soon so that we can see what role they play in this whole story. Now regarding structure, I would say that July's People really favors a rather traditional structure, because basically what we have in this novel is the typical Freytag's pyramid, but without the exposition and without the denouement. Okay, so the story begins when the Smales family, they find themselves being waited on by July, but they are in a mud hut. So we have a typical situation, right? But not in their residence, not in the typical Johannesburg house, but in a mud hut all of a sudden. So the novel starts with an idea of continuity, but also of big difference right there. And we find out what it is that happened, right? The civil war and the violence that is happening in the cities as we continue to read. There's a rising action. There's a climax, as you would expect in the Freytag's pyramid, that is basically a verbal confrontation, and then of course you have the falling action. But in this novel, it's really all about tension. Okay, Nadine Gordimer really takes her time in building up that tension that goes to that climax right there. And then after that culmination, we have an open ending. Okay, and I wanted to share with you something that Nadine Gordimer said about open endings, because this is something that she was asked about in one of the interviews that she gave. So we have here that a member of the audience asked, in July's People, I have some doubt in my mind about the final chapter. And then they mentioned something that I'm not going to mention because I don't want to ruin the ending for you. But Nadine Gordimer answers affirmatively to the question, and then she says, it is what I call an open-ended book. I happen to like open-ended books, other people's open-ended books, because I think that is how life is. There is no conclusion until death, and indeed the consequences of your life go on after your death very often, so that there is no end really. The writer, it's an arbitrary thing. You pick up a life here and you put it down there. I think it's very interesting also because the person is asking specifically about the ending, what happens in the ending, and Nadine Gordimer replies, I think this is what happens. So I think that is amazing when an author is not sure about what happens to his or her characters. I think that is quite the right approach to take when it comes to storytelling and letting the readers figure out an ending, an open ending, or any other event by themselves. So this is a novel that is charged with symbolism. If you look at the premise itself or the situation, it's really a provocative allegory, because what you have here is a role reversal. And after so many years of apartheid, the Smales family find themselves experiencing something close, not really the same thing, right? But something close to what July and many other black people suffered during that time. They are totally dependent on him all of a sudden. They find themselves being constantly humiliated also, and this is something that they are not used to experiencing at all. But specifically, I would say that there are two main symbols in July's People. One of them is the bakkie, or the truck, if you want to call it that, and the other one is the gun. Okay, both of them are, of course, symbols of power. Both of them, maybe you could say, are masculine symbols, or tied to the men in this story right here. So I would say look out for them, and look out for their connection with Maureen's husband, Bam, on the one hand, and also with July on the other hand. Now, I think it's important to note when you read this novel that every character in July's People is trying to adapt to a new situation in some way or another. For example, at one point, July reprimands Maureen because she's trying to do the work of the women in the village, which is what they are supposed to do, right? So notice how we have that reversal right there. Now it is Maureen who is being told what to do and what not to do, what is proper and what is not. And then Bam, for his part, is basically dealing with his masculinity being put into question constantly. From being the guy in charge, he is now completely dependent upon July. And you could say that in this novel, in a way, he is emasculated. You're going to see what I mean by that when you read the story. And then I mentioned very briefly the children before. They are the ones who find it easiest to adapt to the situation. They start to act like the other kids in the village all of a sudden. But we also have to keep in mind that July is also adapting to a new situation. He worked for the Smales family for 15 years, and now all of a sudden he has to leave the city and go back to his place. At one point his wife tells him, "It seems that even you have forgotten how things work around here." So for him, it's also a situation of trying to adapt. And in this whole picture, the Smales family, they have basically come to disturb the order of things. And that is much of the conflict that you can see between the characters in this novel. Now, I want to explore a little bit the psychology of apartheid and how it is presented in the novel. Because what we have here in July's People is an exploration of apartheid, but not just the events of apartheid. This is a novel that, along with the outside and the tangible experience of apartheid, really goes into a profound exploration of that system as an inner psychological reality. And I think that is much of the value that this novel has as a document, if we are going to look at it that way. So one aspect in which that becomes evident, right, the idea of the psychology of apartheid, has to do with the language. July calls Bam master, okay, and this is something that the Smales told him not to do when they were back in the city, but he cannot break away from that type of language. So that's one quick example of that. We are also told that Bam doesn't really understand July. He doesn't understand his broken English, as it is called. Maureen, on the other hand, really has no trouble understanding July, and even at some points she is a kind of interpreter or translator to Bam so that he can understand. So it's interesting, I think, how we have that connection between July, right, the black man, and the woman. They have no problem understanding each other, but the man is somehow outside of that. He cannot penetrate this broken English. July's English by itself is really interesting also because it is a kind of working English. And that is another point that the narrator makes clear when she talks about this. It says, they could assume comprehension between them only if she kept away from even the most commonplace of abstractions. His was the English learned in kitchens, factories, and mines. It was based on orders and responses, not the exchange of ideas and feelings. So you could see how even the language is a tool or an instrument in this case, and it is something that also causes that division between the two races. And continuing with this idea of the psychology of apartheid, I wanted to share with you something that Nadine Gordimer said in an interview, and also a little piece of my personal experience that I had when I visited South Africa many years ago. So Nadine Gordimer was asked about remaining in South Africa and living there when she considered apartheid to be an unbearable system and an unbearable reality. The interviewer said, you take buses reserved for whites, you go to a cinema for whites, you go to a beach open only to whites. How does one deal with that? And this is Nadine Gordimer's answer. One has an immense sense of shame, but one ends by forgetting it. When you take a bus, you direct yourself automatically towards the stops reserved for whites. It is human nature to allow oneself to be conditioned without even noticing what is happening. You know, I had an experience when I was there This was, as I said, a very long time ago, but we are still talking about post-apartheid South Africa. I was a little kid when I visited. It was an amazing, unforgettable experience. I was just in love with South Africa. It's just such a beautiful country. And I visited Cape Town. We went to Kruger Park also. Of course, I went with my family. We also visited Johannesburg. I was looking at some pictures the other day so that I could share some with you. And unfortunately, I was a kid and I was not very good at deciding what to take pictures of, really. So I don't have that many good pictures of my experience there. Most of the pictures are actually from the Kruger Park days, and they're just heartbreakingly bad. Okay, this was before digital photography, so they're not that very good, but I just want to share with you some of the pictures that I have right here. But anyway, what happened was one day we were at Johannesburg and we were waiting for the bus. And we were just waiting there, and there was a black man sitting on this thing that you were not supposed to sit on. And we arrived there, so my father sat on the same place. He was just a few feet away from the black man. And then a black policeman came, and he went and he told the black man that he could not sit there. But he didn't say anything to my father. So I think that's a very small example. It's a seemingly insignificant event, but I think it speaks volumes by itself of how ingrained this system of apartheid is in people's minds. Of course, my father got up, as soon as he realized what was happening. That's not the point here. I think it's a good example, though, of how this whole thing worked. And I thought it added something to what Nadine Gordimer was saying about how we condition ourselves to all of these circumstances. It's part of what it's like to be a human being. I want to add a note about the style of the novel, okay? I'm going to say that Nadine Gordimer is probably one of the most original authors that I have read when it comes to style. And this is something that you can tell even by the way the words look on the page, okay? For example, she uses the dash in order to indicate dialogue. That's just a tiny example of that. But even the structure of her sentences is just very personal, okay? Now, for that reason, it took me a while to get used to her style and to just basically look at the world, the way that she looks at it. But I think it's a very rewarding experience. And it's also a very good sign. When you read sentences by an author and you have trouble understanding them, most of the time what that means is that they have a style that is not the typical one. They have a personal style that is maybe a little bit of a challenge to understand at first. But after you accommodate yourself to that as a reader, you get that wonderful experience of an original voice, basically. So listen to an example. I want to share with you something. I'm not going to tell you what it is that is being described here or what the situation is, but I just want you to listen to the sentences. This is on page 124. There is no music of the spheres. Science killed that, along with all other myths. There are only the sounds of chaos, roaring, rending, crackling, out of which the order that is the world has been won. No peace beyond this world, not there either. When the racket was lost a moment, only a cosmic sigh. They heard the sough of time and space, the wave poised over everything. It's really interesting. You know what is going on here? It's basically they're trying to listen to the radio and the radio is not working. So, I mean, just that way of describing something like that and the way she uses the words and the sentence structure is just amazing. So Nadine Gordimer is really one of those authors that we should read for the style. The novel itself, as I told you, is 160 pages, but I would say it's a novel that you can read quickly, but it is not a quick read, because it's not meant to be read quickly. It's meant to be savored, the style itself. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about is something that has to do with Nadine Gordimer's own ideas about July's People that she shared in an interview. Because here's what happened. At the time that the novel was published in the 1980s, people were calling it a visionary novel. Okay, that is a word that they used a lot because it was a kind of alternate history, right? So at one point, one interviewer asked her about that, and that's the part that I wanted to share. So the interviewer said, "Your recent novel, July's People, is a visionary novel. Does it reflect what you actually think will happen, or are you just playing with the future?" And Nadine Gordimer answered, "I was playing with the present. looking at what we were doing in South Africa that could very well bring about that kind of consequence. In the few years since it was written, of course, many of the things which seemed like science fiction then have begun to happen. And it's not because I'm a seer or a prophet, but because it was there. We'd been doing things that would bring this about. I think it's very important when we read this novel to remember something that Nadine Gordimer said elsewhere also. This is not a novel that deals with South Africa after a revolution or after this type of unrest, but during that. If you look at the very start, like at the very beginning of the novel, it comes with an epigraph by Antonio Gramsci from the prison notebooks, and it says, "The old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum there arises a great diversity of morbid symptoms." So I think the key word right there is interregnum. Once again, you know, it's not after, but during. It's really an immediate story, and that's what gives it so much power, I think. So the bottom line here, I would say that I am not only glad that I read July's People, I am very, very happy that I reread it. Okay, many of these experiences that I'm sharing with you, I'm basically rereading the books to give you an idea of what it was like for me to read at least one book by every winner of the Nobel Prize. So I really have you to thank. Otherwise, I don't think I would have reread many of these books, and I'm enjoying them so much right now. Many of them, probably most of them, much more than I did back then when I read them as a younger person. Now, I don't even think I need to say this, but the fact that apartheid, thank God, is a thing of the past really takes away none of the novel's power, none of its relevance, and none of its greatness. Okay, July's People, if you want to experience something by Nadine Gordimer, this is a really good place to start, and it is representative of her style, of her narrative art and all that. But I want to say this, I really enjoyed My Son's Story. So I want to recommend this one, especially if you're interested in storytelling, in plot. Okay, because July's People is not so much about the story or about the plot, it's more about the situation, though it's not a novella. Okay, I do want to say that for many reasons that we're not going to go into. If you like a story, I would say this is probably a better option for you, and I highly recommend it. I enjoyed it very, very much. And here's another cool thing about it. It was published right before Nadine Gordimer won the Nobel Prize in Literature. It's a novel from 1990, and she won the award the following year. So highly recommended, My Son's Story. And for me, the next step is going to be Berger's Daughter. Okay, I don't remember if I read this novel completely. I can tell you for sure that I started it. If I did read it, I read it really, really quickly in order to do a project that I was doing for one of my classes that I chose to write on Nadine Gordimer. So I do want to explore this again or for the first time, depending on the case. My memory is not really helping me very much here. But Berger's Daughter is another very important novel by her. So, do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Those were my 2 cents on July's People, an excellent novel by Nadine Gordimer. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.